The wedding chamber smelled of rot. Not the sharp rot of meat or garbage, but something more perfumed, sweeter. A death disguised as celebration. The scent of lilies left too long in water, of dried rose petals packed with frankincense, of bodies sweating through ceremonial linen. And behind it, all the musk of fear, thick and metallic, coming from the girl who stood trembling at the entrance. She was 12. Her skin was powdered white and her eyes rimmed in cold, as if pretending to be a woman might shield her from what was coming. But nothing could disguise the way her fingers shook beneath her golden bangles. Before her stood the man she called Father Ptolemy III, King of Egypt, once a general under Alexander the Great. He waited beneath a gilded canopy, dressed not as a father but as a groom, a shimmering blue and gold Nemes headdress on his brow. The priests chanted prayers in two languages, Greek for the court, Egyptian for the gods, dual tongues to bless a marriage no god should have sanctioned. Arsinoe II stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold limestone floor. Her father extended his hand, and she placed hers in it like a child caught in a game she didn't understand. The wedding ceremony proceeded. The sacred rites of the Ptolemaic dynasty weren't whispered of in alleyways or hidden in tombs. They were performed openly, lavishly, gloriously. Because in this world, incest was not a crime. It was policy. It was ritual. It was divine. This was Egypt reborn under the rule of the Greeks. When Alexander the Great died, his empire splintered like broken glass. One of his most cunning lieutenants, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt not as a satrap or steward, but as Pharaoh. The people of the Nile, used to centuries of divine kingship, didn't want a foreign general, they wanted gods. And so Ptolemy became one, the living Horus, the son of Ra, a man made immortal by propaganda and the careful borrowing of Egyptian myths. But to be seen as a god, he needed more than crowns and temples. He needed to mimic the gods themselves. In the myth of Osiris and Isis, the brother and sister who ruled together divine siblings created the world through their union. What better way to claim divinity than to marry your sister? Or in Ptolemy's case, your daughter Arsinoe was born in Macedon, but raised in Alexandria. She grew up surrounded by marble colonnades and papyrus scrolls where Greek philosophers debated fate and Egyptian priests studied stars. A hybrid world. A mask of civilization stretched over something much older and darker. Her earliest memories weren't of lullabies, but of ceremonial processions of being paraded like a symbol, not a child. Her mother, Berenice I, was Ptolemy's favorite wife, but even love was a political calculation. Arsinoe was beautiful, clever, and most importantly, of pure blood. The first time she bled, the palace rejoiced. Not because she had become a woman, but because she could now be used. Imagine the wedding feast tables piled with roasted lamb, honeyed dates, jugs of wine stained red. Imagine the laughter, the lyres, the dancers twirling with silk that brushed the ground like mist. And at the head of it all, a girl child seated beside her father-husband, her face painted into serenity, her eyes empty as desert stone. The marriage was symbolic, but not merely so. It carried weight. It carried law. It reinforced the dynasty's image as gods on earth. To the Alexandrian Greeks, it was strange but tolerable. To the native Egyptians, it was divine mimicry. To Arsinoe, it was a beginning, not of power, of survival. Because what no one spoke of was what came after the wedding the night itself. The closing of the doors, the snuffing of the lamps, the silken bed prepared not for rest but for sealing a royal covenant with a child's body. The priests had said this union would bring fortune, fertility, glory. But the walls didn't echo with blessings, only silence, and maybe a single stifled cry. From that moment on, Arsinoe was no longer merely a princess. She was a queen by design, a symbol of divine incest made flesh. Her body was the myth made real, her life a chapter in a lie older than history. And yet something shifted in her. She did not collapse. She did not break. Arsinoe watched. She learned. She memorized every face that dared smile at her pain, every courtier who whispered behind her back, every priest who dared call her holy. The palace was a serpent's den, and she had been thrown inside with bleeding feet. But not for nothing. The gods of Egypt were cruel and eternal, and Arsinoe would become one of them. Years later, when her father died rotting from age and disease behind a screen of silk, Arsinoe stood over his embalmed corpse and did not weep. She had played her part. She had fulfilled her father's twisted legacy, but the play was not over, not even close. The question was no longer how a daughter could survive a marriage to her father. The question now was, what does a girl become when her bloodline is a cage and her only escape is through fire? She left Egypt not as a disgraced queen, but as a calculated ghost slipping out beneath a veil of ceremonial mourning. Her father's body lay embalmed in the sacred temple of Saqqara, his royal mask fixed in a golden smile, but Arsinoe did not stay to watch the rituals of divine passage. Her work in Egypt was done for now. Her next assignment, marriage. Again. This time to Lysimachus, king of Thrace and Macedonia. He was old, too old. His teeth were stained and his breath carried the bitter smell of fermented figs and unspoken regrets. His skin hung loose from his jaw like a robe too large. But he had one thing Arsinoe needed: power. A throne of his own and lands to the north carved from Alexander's corpse. For Arsinoe, who had spent her adolescence surviving in a palace that fed on its own children, a new court was simply a new hunting ground. But Thrace was no haven. It was a festering swamp of ambition and revenge, and the moment she arrived, Arsinoe felt the knives behind the courtesies. Lysimachus already had sons. One in particular, Agathocles, was dangerous, not because he was cruel, but because he was beloved. By the court, by the people, by his father, a popular heir, an obstacle. And obstacles Arsinoe had learned were meant to be removed. She played the long game. First she bore Lysimachus, 3 sons legitimizing her position and deepening her roots in the royal family tree. Then slowly she poisoned the air between father and son, not with arsenic but with whispers. Agathocles, she said, was plotting with Seleucus, the eastern warlord. He had spies, secret letters, a dagger hidden under his pillow. No one knows if the letters she found were real. Perhaps they were forged. Perhaps Agathocles was guilty. It didn't matter. Lysimachus had his son imprisoned. The court watched with horror as the once proud prince, eyes wide with betrayal, was dragged away in chains. He was dead within days, poisoned, stabbed, or simply left to rot. His death was a blur of rumor and denial. Arsinoe never blinked. But what she didn't count on was the fury that would follow. The people turned. The nobles whispered. And Seleucus, true to prophecy or paranoia, marched on Thrace. Lysimachus, now an old man unraveling with grief and guilt, led his army into battle and was slaughtered. His body lay hacked open on a battlefield he no longer recognized, his golden breastplate torn like parchment. Arsinoe was widowed, again, but this time she didn't mourn. She gathered her 3 sons, still boys, wide-eyed and silent, and retreated to the coastal city of Cassandreia, a fortress city built by her late husband. There she declared herself regent, not in mourning, but in control. The throne she claimed was not dead. It lived on in her bloodline, in her sons. But she had miscalculated. Seleucus was not done. He stormed the city, and Arsinoe barely escaped with her life, smuggling her children out under the cover of darkness. The fires of rebellion painting the night sky in blood-orange flame. For a moment she seemed finished. A woman on the run, her husband's dead, her enemies growing like mold. But if there was one thing Arsinoe had learned, it was this: power never dies. It changes address. And so she turned her eyes back to Egypt, to the land of incense and rot, to the place where her blood had first been auctioned off beneath golden shrines. But this time she would not return as daughter or bride. She would return as contender. The Pharaoh now was her brother Ptolemy II, born of the same father, cradled by the same mother. A boy she once cradled. A boy she once watched scream through fevers and giggle in fountains. But now he wore the crown, and he too had married for power. His current wife was another Arsinoe, the daughter of Lysimachus, ironically. A cruel twist of fate. Arsinoe II had replaced her own mother's role, and now she faced the woman who had replaced her. But there was a problem. The throne was unstable. Ptolemy II was weak-willed and surrounded by vultures' advisors who fattened themselves on his indecision. Factions formed in the court. Intrigues multiplied. And above it all, Arsinoe watched from the shadows waiting for her brother to call her home. When he finally did under the pretense of reconciliation, the courtiers held their breath. No one dared ask why the disgraced widow of Thrace was being welcomed back to the Golden Palace of Alexandria. No one questioned why the old wounds of incest were being reopened. But Arsinoe knew, because the only thing stronger than blood was ambition. She arrived cloaked in mourning and myth. Her sons were gone, hidden, exiled, or dead, but she, the queen of ghosts, still lived. And when she stepped off the barge, the Nile lapping at her feet like a dog, the crowd whispered not with pity but fear. Something had returned. Something they thought buried. Not a woman, not a sister, but a force. And soon her brother would no longer be Pharaoh alone. He would be her husband. Again. Alexandria gleamed like a jewel pressed against the sea-white marble temples, bronze statues catching the sun and columns so tall they seemed to scrape heaven. But within the palace walls the air was heavy. Not just with heat, but with expectation, with dread, with the knowledge that something unnatural was about to happen again. Arsinoe II walked those halls like she had never left. Her feet remembered the weight of the polished stone, the curve of each stair. But she was no longer the girl forced into her father's bed. She was older now, hardened like bronze cast too hot. Her beauty had matured into something sharper, like a sculpture of a goddess made with a knife, not a chisel. And at the center of this temple to ambition sat her brother Ptolemy II. He looked like their father, broad forehead, curling beard, eyes that could smile and chill at once. But he lacked the iron beneath the skin. Ptolemy was soft. Not physically, his body was draped in gold and linen, healthy, well-fed. But his spine, his will. They were brittle things. He was a scholar king, a poet, a man of science and myth, and in this world that made him pray. The moment they met eyes, the court saw it. Something electric passed between them, not affection, not recognition, but calculation. She bowed. He smiled. And the room felt like it had been locked from the inside. At first, Arsinoe moved like a shadow, never officially announced, never openly favored. But within weeks, she had replaced half the palace staff. Her name was whispered in administrative scrolls. Her scent clung to the corridors, and then without ceremony, her brother's wife disappeared. Arsinoe, his official queen. The other Arsinoe was accused of treason. The charge was vague, its evidence theatrical. A plot to overthrow the king, perhaps aided by her children. No proof was ever made public. But it didn't matter. She was arrested during a feast, dragged from the palace in the middle of the night, her screams echoing down the columns like an oracle cursed. Her children were stripped of titles and exiled. She was imprisoned in Coptos, far from Alexandria, far from mercy. And so the path was cleared. The wedding announcement came like a thunderclap. Ptolemy II was to marry his full sister Arsinoe II, not as a political alliance, not as a temporary regency, but as queen and king, husband and wife, god and goddess. They gave her a new name, Philadelphos, loving her brother, a name that cloaked horror in silk. The ceremony was held at the great temple of Ptah, where the air stank of lotus myrrh and something darker like sweat left to ferment under gold. The priests chanted not with shock, but with reverence, because to the Egyptian mind this was not depravity. This was divine precedent. Isis and Osiris reborn. The heavenly siblings returned to bless the world through union. But the Greeks, they were less forgiving. In hushed tones, philosophers called the union grotesque. Poets mocked it in coded verse. Even the Alexandrian elite, who had learned to swallow all manner of royal excess, shuddered at the implications. But the Ptolemies had already laid the groundwork. Statues of the new couple were erected beside those of gods. Coins were minted with their conjoined faces, siblings frozen in eternal incestuous embrace. The people were told this is no crime. This is sacred. This is eternal order. Arsinoe's power grew by the hour. She did not act as queen consort. She ruled. Documents bore her seal. Edicts were issued in her voice. Foreign ambassadors bowed to her first. Ptolemy, once a king, had become her shadow. Charmed perhaps, but increasingly irrelevant. The palace became her theater. The court her audience. There was no one left to oppose her. Or so she thought. In the outer provinces where the Nile curved through lands thick with rebellion and famine, whispers stirred. Priests muttered that something was off in the divine order. Lightning struck the roof of a temple in Memphis. A comet crossed the night sky above Thebes. Portents, they said. Warnings. And even within the court, unease festered like a wound under silk. Because though Arsinoe had secured the throne, she had paid dearly. Her sons, her legacy through Lysimachus had vanished. Rumors said two had been executed in secret by Seleucus. One may have fled to Macedonia. Others claimed she had sacrificed them herself for political favor. Whatever the truth, she was now a goddess without heirs. A queen whose womb had once birthed power now sat silent, empty, embalmed in ceremony. She ruled beside her brother, but beneath the gold she was alone. And perhaps afraid, because Ptolemy's II, though pliable, was not predictable. The same blood that had made him brother and husband also made him a rival. One whisper in the wrong ear, one scroll sealed by the wrong hand, and everything she had built could crumble. She had orchestrated poisonings before. She had sent queens into exile, husbands to war, sons to their deaths. But now she shared her bed with someone just as royal, just as dangerous, and the question hung in the palace air like smoke from an unholy fire. What happens when your greatest enemy shares your name, your blood, and your pillow? In the echoing marble halls of Alexandria's palace, two women shared a name, but only one could wear the crown. Arsinoe. I had been removed, cast out like a pawn too close to the king's flank, but she wasn't gone. Not really. Exiled in Coptos, surrounded by dust and guards, loyal to no one, she waited. And though the world thought her defeated, she remained the greatest threat to Arsinoe II's reign. Because her son's true heirs to Ptolemy II were still alive, and where there were sons, there were claims. The new queen, Arsinoe II, knew this. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her temples like a crown too tight. Her throne wasn't a seat of comfort. It was a fortress built on shifting sand. She had married her brother. She had orchestrated a queen's downfall. But the people remembered the first Arsinoe. They remembered her dignity, her lineage, her children. The whispers did not stop. Whispers could kill. So Arsinoe II sharpened her strategy like a blade. First, she spread rumors that Arsinoe II had plotted to poison the king, that her sons were consorting with Seleucid spies, that secret messages had been intercepted plans to depose Ptolemy and restore her line. These whispers spread like fire through the library chambers, through temple courtyards, even into the court's theater troops. Stories played out in puppet shows, in shadows cast by oil lamps. Arsinoe. I was no longer a woman. She was a villain carved in smoke. Then came the arrests. Advisors loyal to the first queen were seized, interrogated. One drowned mysteriously in the Nile after confessing to a non-existent plot. Another was found hanged by his own belt in the palace latrines. Convenient, but effective. Still, the threat remained. As long as Arsinoe lived, there was a ghost haunting the throne. The final blow came not with a sword, but a scroll. It was said to be a peace offering, a letter from Arsinoe II to her banished rival. Warm, even kind. An invitation to return to Alexandria to be restored in spirit, if not in station. Some say it was written in her own hand, sealed with her personal ring, an onyx scarab, engraved with a vulture and a lotus. Arsinoe. I never arrived. No official report was issued. No body was recovered. But her name vanished from all records. Her children disappeared into distant provinces, adopted, imprisoned, or quietly erased. In the temple scrolls, her image was scratched away. Even her statues were melted down and recast in the likeness of her usurper. And just like that, there was only one Arsinoe left in Egypt. Now undisputed Queen Arsinoe II launched her next campaign not with blood, but with divinity. She declared herself the sister wife of the king, not in shame, but as a badge of divine appointment. Coins bore the title Philadelphos. Paintings showed her side by side with Ptolemy, not as queen and king, but as equals. As Osiris and Isis reborn. She sponsored massive temple renovations. Priests were paid to rewrite sacred texts, inserting her name beside God's. New hymns were composed in her honor. Statues rose in every major city, each one showing her, with the wings of Mahat, the goddess of justice, holding both the crook and the flail. Symbols of rule. Symbols of balance. But this was not balance. It was domination. Even the court couldn't look her directly in the eye anymore. There was something in her gaze now, cold, unreadable, like someone who had crossed so many lines that morality had become meaningless. She didn't flinch at executions. She didn't smile at offerings. She was both revered and feared. The queen who had devoured her own past, and Ptolemy. He stood beside her like a wax figure, smiling, nodding, empty. Whether he was complicit, bewitched, or merely broken, no one could say. Perhaps he loved her. Perhaps he feared her. Most likely he simply didn't matter anymore, because Arsinoe had won. She was queen of Upper and Lower Egypt, goddess on earth, sister, wife, ruler, and widow all in one. But even in her triumph, something rotten festered beneath the gold. There were rumors of strange ceremonies held at night, of secret chambers beneath the palace where priestesses danced barefoot in pools of blood, of dreams that woke the queen screaming. Her attendants claimed she sleepwalked, that she whispered her dead son's names to the walls, that she cursed the stars for being too quiet. And once, just once, a servant girl swore she heard Arsinoe say the name Arsinoe II in her sleep. Not with hatred, with regret. But regret was a luxury Arsinoe could no longer afford. She had become more than a woman, more than a queen. She had become a story, a myth sealed in flesh, and the question that now slithered through the palace halls beneath the throne behind the heavy curtains of incense and gold. Was this, how long can a mortal woman play God? Before the gods demand a price? They were boys when she last saw them. 3 sons with curls like twisted olive branches and voices just beginning to deepen. The children of her second marriage, sired by Lysimachus of Thrace. They had once clung to her silk robes during royal processions, whispering questions into her sleeves. But by the time Arsinoe II solidified her throne in Egypt, her sons had become shadows, displaced unwanted reminders of a past dripping with blood. And yet they were princes, blood of 2 kingdoms, heirs to 2 empires. That made them dangerous. The curse of Thrace followed them like smoke. After Lysimachus's death, when Seleucus marched through Macedon and claimed his lands, Arsinoe's sons were caught in a web of broken loyalties. At first she hid them, then she used them. She sent one Ptolemy of Telmessos to Asia Minor under the protection of a Ptolemaic ally. The second, Lysimachus the Younger, she groomed for leadership, telling courtiers he would one day rule in her name. The third, Philip, simply vanished from records, a ghost child. Perhaps dead, perhaps hidden. But hiding only worked for so long. When Arsinoe ascended beside her brother as Queen of Egypt, her eyes turned outward. Her bloodline stretched across seas tangled in old claims and burning with potential. She saw an empire reborn not just through her, but through her sons. They would reclaim Thrace. They would rise in her name. They would finish what Lysimachus started. So she did what Arsinoe always did. She whispered. Letters were sent. Alliances rekindled. Coins minted in secret bore her sons' faces beside ancient Thracian symbols. In temples far from Alexandria, prayers were offered to the sons of the queen, though few dared say which queen. There were meetings in the dead of night, envoys from Macedon scribes who vanished after their scrolls were delivered. Even Seleucid spies took notice. And then, without warning, her eldest son rebelled. Lysimachus the Younger raised an army in the north, proclaiming himself rightful heir to Thrace. It was a gamble bold, brash, and doomed. Within months, he was captured. Some say he was betrayed by his own men. Others claim a Ptolemaic informant sold him out. Either way, he was delivered to the court of Seleucus, beaten and bloodied, dragged like a trophy through streets that once sang his name. Arsinoe received the news during a temple ceremony honoring her deification. As the crowd chanted her praises, a servant slipped her a note. Her hand did not tremble. She did not break rhythm. She smiled. But later that night, a priest found her alone in the chamber of sacred oils, sobbing into the foot of her own statue. Her son was executed days later, not by sword, not by poison, but strangled with a silk cord, a royal death for a royal traitor. His body was returned naked and bruised, wrapped in a shroud with no name. Arsinoe did not claim it, because she couldn't. If she wept for a rebel, she'd betray the crown. If she admitted he was her son, the court would see weakness. And Arsinoe II had no room left for grief. Only ghosts. The second son, Ptolemy, fared better. He kept low, governing a quiet region near Caria. He minted coins with his own face, yes, but never raised a sword. He ruled just enough to stay useful, just little enough to be ignored. Arsinoe watched him from afar, never calling him home, because she knew what the palace did to sons. There were nights she awoke screaming, nights when she walked the gardens barefoot, murmuring the names of her children into the wind. A servant once swore he heard her whisper, "They died for me, and I killed them." But in the morning she was stone again, unmoving, unforgiving, and Philip, her third son. He had been swallowed by history. No grave, no records, not even a statue, only silence. Perhaps that was the kindest fate. What the world did not understand, what no scroll ever truly captured, was the cost of power for a woman in the ancient world. She had survived marriage to her father. She had watched one husband fall in battle, another crumble in disgrace. She had exiled a rival queen, orchestrated purges, rewritten myth into law, but motherhood that had broken her in ways politics never could. She was a goddess now, worshipped, carved into stone. Her name sung in temples beside Ptolemies. And yet every time she looked at those statues, all she saw was who was missing. No son stood beside her, no heirs. Only her brother. Always her brother. She had sacrificed her children on the altar of dynasty, not with daggers, but with silence, with distance, with ambition so bright it burned through blood. And the people, of course, loved her for it. They called her Thea Philadelphos, the goddess who loves her brother. They prayed to her in times of drought. They touched her image to heal the sick. They said she had ascended, but at night, behind the veils of incense and ceremony, behind the painted smiles and the chants, she dreamed of 3 small hands wrapped around her fingers, and woke with her fists clenched and empty. The people believed she ruled alone because she was divine, but the truth was simpler, sadder. She ruled alone because everyone she ever loved was dead, and the only question left, the one that poisoned even her dreams, was this: if power cost her everything, why did she still want more? They built temples in her name, not small ones tucked into city corners, but monuments. Colossal, blinding. Pillars so high they scraped the sky, statues so detailed you could see the veins in the marble. Arsinoe stood beside the gods now, literally. In Alexandria, Thebes, and Memphis, she was etched into sacred walls, worshipped not as queen, but as Thea Philadelphos, the sister goddess, the one who ruled not merely over Egypt, but with Egypt, as if her blood pumped through the very Nile. But it was all a lie, a beautiful, elaborate, divine lie. She had crafted it herself, every word, every symbol. She paid scribes to revise the old myths, inserting her name between Isis and Hathor, wedging herself into the stories of origin. The people swallowed it like honeyed wine. They wanted to believe. After decades of war, incest, disappearances, and executions, the people craved order, any order, even if it reeked of perfume and rot. So she gave them divinity. She declared that her union with Ptolemy II had not been born of blood, but of cosmic balance. That just as the sun and moon moved in harmony, so too must brother and sister. Together they restored Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept of universal order. Incest wasn't sin, it was symmetry, harmony, sacred mathematics. She held court wearing the vulture crown of Upper Egypt and the cobra of Lower Egypt, symbols of duality. In one hand she carried the crook of a shepherd, in the other the flail of judgment. To the people it meant compassion and punishment. To Arsinoe it meant control. She minted coins that told stories. On one side her profile delicate and commanding, on the other double eagles or twin deities, always echoing the divine twinning of her and her brother. Even the coinage whispered of incest made noble by theology. Every transaction was a prayer, every offering a submission. But behind the curtain the machinery of power groaned. Ptolemy had faded. Once a king, now an icon. He gave speeches, yes, but only ones written for him. He signed decrees but never read them. His eyes seemed always distant, as if he was floating just above his own crown. Some said he had gone mad, others that he had fallen under Arsinoe's spell, but no one dared say what they truly feared, that she had absorbed him, consumed him. He was no longer Ptolemy, he was the male half of Arsinoe. She ruled through festivals, processions that swallowed entire cities, parades with gold-painted bulls and dancers with knives hidden in their skirts. Music that never ended, children named after her, even infants baptized in her likeness naked but for golden crowns and tiny scepters. But the darker rites, they were quieter. There were rumors of ceremonies held underground in chambers not mapped on any scroll, rituals involving sacred oils mixed with blood, offerings buried alive beneath temple foundations. A whisper that Arsinoe had bathed in crocodile bile and lotus ash to keep her skin pale, her eyes wide, her body unaging. It may have been myth, but it felt true, because Arsinoe never seemed to change. She grew older, yes, but only slightly. Her attendants claimed her hair had not grayed, that her lips were still the same shade of wine-dark red, that her blood, when drawn in sacred cuts, steamed as if it refused to cool. Some believed she had become immortal. Others believed she had simply become too powerful to die. But there were cracks in the marble. In papyri letters from foreign diplomats, descriptions of her became increasingly strange. She speaks to unseen things, wrote one ambassador from Rhodes. She hums songs with no melody. Her shadow flickers when she does not move. Another wrote, she called me by my father's name, though she had never met him. Her eyes are not her own. She had become something else. Not a woman, not a queen, a relic, a force, a god-shaped wound. And yet the empire bowed. The cult of Arsinoe spread like a fever. Shrines to her appeared in distant provinces. Fishermen swore that praying to her spared their nets. Farmers claimed she could bring rain with a whisper. Prostitutes left offerings at her statue's feet, asking for beauty and protection. She was everything lover, mother, judge, executioner. No one noticed that Ptolemy had nearly disappeared. His last public appearance was a silent one, standing at her side during a festival to honor their divine birthright. He smiled vaguely, moved his hand when cued, then returned to the palace and never left again. He died soon after. No fanfare, no public mourning, just a quiet shift. And Arsinoe did not flinch, because now she truly ruled alone. She declared Ptolemy a god and had temples built to house his memory. She sat in both thrones, king and queen Horus, an Isis ruler and worshipper. Her name was now written in cartouches, those sacred ovals once reserved for male pharaohs. She had overwritten history, and beneath the golden paint and polished marble, something deeply unnatural had taken root. Arsinoe's presence, her existence, became a contradiction. A queen who defied mortality, a mother without children, a widow who wore her wedding jewels, a sister wife who ruled as if untouched by sin. But in the deepest parts of the palace where the torches smoked and the air never moved, her servants whispered a different title. Not queen, not goddess, Which? They said her footsteps echoed when she was not walking, that her voice could be heard in the walls even when she slept, that every night she anointed her forehead with a black oil said to be mixed with the ashes of her sons. And still, the people bowed. They lit candles. They sang hymns. They kissed her likeness carved into stone. Because no one dared ask the real question. What kind of world have we built where the only woman left to worship is the one who buried her own humanity in gold? The death of a god is never announced. It begins with silence. No trumpet blasts, no falling stars. Just an absence, soft at first, a missing smile, a cancelled procession, a door that remains closed a little too long. Arsinoe stopped appearing in public. It began subtly. A mist festival here, a silent equinox there. The court claimed she was contemplating that the divine queen had entered a sacred retreat of prayer and purification. The priests echoed it in their chants. The scribes copied it onto temple walls, but behind the silken veils of state propaganda panic began to fester. Because Arsinoe had not simply vanished from the public eye, she was decaying behind the walls of her own myth. Attendants whispered of her body failing. One leg swollen grotesquely, her skin mottled with purple blotches that spread like ink beneath the flesh. Her once flawless complexion peeled in patches, revealing raw red beneath. Some believed it was cancer, others divine punishment. The papyri physicians dared not name it. They described her affliction in riddles, a sickness that feasts upon the inside first. She refused their treatments. She claimed she would be healed by the gods because she was one. She clung to the ritual oils, the holy salves, the sacred chants. But the rot did not listen to prayers. It bloomed. Her voice, once sharp enough to silence a chamber, grew hoarse, then shallow, then gone. She took to her bed veiled in linen and guarded by eunuchs who spoke to no one. Her chamber was sealed from all but a few priests who swore to secrecy before they crossed the threshold. What they saw in that darkened room was never recorded, but one rumor persisted that Arsinoe no longer spoke in her own voice, that she chanted things in dead languages, and sometimes laughed long and soft and completely alone. The court tried to carry on. The high priest of Alexandria presided over ceremonies in her name. Grain shipments still bore her seal, but everyone knew. Even the birds around the palace seemed quieter, as if mourning had already begun. And then the day came. No proclamation, no fanfare, just a line of incense drifting from the queen's chambers, and a figure in mourning robes, tall, silent and trembling, walking toward the sacred embalming house. The embalming took 70 days, a full divine process. Her body, once a vessel of myth, was now treated like the relic she had become. Organs were removed and sealed in alabaster jars. Her face was reconstructed with wax and resin. Perfumed linen was wrapped layer upon layer until she became a statue, immobile, untouchable. She was no longer a person. She was a monument. And yet something felt unfinished. Tradition demanded her tomb be built in Memphis or Thebes, but Arsinoe's burial was different. Her remains were secretly transported to a secluded island in the Nile Delta. There, in a temple carved into the rock itself, she was placed in a chamber so deep and so dark that not even the high priest knew its full map. No inscriptions marked the entrance. No statues lined the path. Just silence and a scent of lotus, overpowering, nauseating, like it was hiding something. Some said she had ordered it that way, that she feared what might come after death, that she knew her life, her choices, her sins, even divinely sanctioned, would not pass unchallenged in the underworld. Others believed she had never died at all, that her body was too holy to decay, that she had transformed, ascended, transcended flesh. Some even claimed to have seen her wandering the gardens of the palace at night, her face veiled, her hands streaked in black oil. The more reasonable truth was more haunting. She had been buried, forgotten by some, revered by others. But her cult did not die. Her statues remained in temples across Egypt. In some cities, her worship grew stronger. Her likeness was added to fertility rituals, to birth charms, even to military prayers. Women cried to her in childbirth. Soldiers invoked her before battle. She was protector, punisher, a mother who had sacrificed everything, a goddess who knew pain. And yet, her legacy bled, because the priests began to whisper. She had married her father, her brother. She had sent her sons to death. She had executed a queen, rewritten sacred laws, mutilated truth until it fit the shape of her ambition. Was that divinity or desecration? A new generation of scholars tried to separate the myth from the woman, but it was impossible. Arsinoe had blurred the lines too well. She had wrapped her sins in gold leaf, sealed them in incense smoke, and called them divine. And so she remained both sacred and profane, immortal not in body but in contradiction. And perhaps that was her greatest triumph, or her final curse. Because long after her heart stopped beating, long after her name faded from court documents, long after her temples crumbled, the question still remained, did she become a god? Or did she simply bury her humanity so deep no one could find it again? Her name was whispered long after her bones turned to dust. Arsinoe II, the queen who married her father, then her brother. The widow who fed on dynasties like carrion. The goddess sculpted not from marble but from trauma. Her cult didn't die with her embalmed corpse. It metastasized. In the decades following her death, her worship spread like a perfume-laced plague. Shrines to Thea Philadelphos emerged in cities far from Egypt's heart. Delos Rhodes' Cyrene. Her image appeared not just beside her brother on coins, but alone divine, eternal, enthroned. Even the Ptolemaic navy swore oaths to her as their patron goddess. Not Isis, not Athena. Arsinoe. Her face became a mask worn by generations of queens who followed. Cleopatra VII. The infamous one would emulate Arsinoe's methods centuries later, branding herself a goddess, a divine consort, a sibling ruler. But Arsinoe had done it first, had done it best. Cleopatra might have died with a snakebite, but Arsinoe died as something worse, a myth that could not be exorcised. She was no longer a person. She was architecture, a foundation upon which an entire dynasty was built. And the dynasty would bleed for it, because the Ptolemaic obsession with incest born from Arsinoe's union poisoned the royal bloodline. Generation after generation, sister wed to brother, cousin to cousin. The thrones became mausoleums. Fertility shriveled. Madness whispered from one king's skull to the next. Assassinations multiplied. Civil wars erupted between siblings raised in the same nursery, trained to kiss with one hand and stab with the other. Even the Romans, no strangers to depravity, looked on in horror, and still her cult endured. In some remote regions of Egypt, women still placed offerings before effigies of Arsinoe, centuries after her tomb was sealed. Not out of loyalty, but fear. She had become something else entirely. Not a saint. Not a savior. A warning. Today, fragments of her story survive in museum cases and archaeological footnotes. A coin worn smooth by centuries. A temple carving defaced by later rulers. A statue headless but still sitting upright, hands resting on her knees as if still listening. And in the ruins of her legacy, we are left with the most unsettling truth of all. That Arsinoe's story wasn't a deviation from power, it was the blueprint. She understood what history would never admit, that empires are not built on virtue. They are sculpted from flesh lies, incest, and silence. That the line between God and monster is not carved in stone, but traced in blood. And when the world worships power enough times, it forgets to ask where that power came from. So the next time you see the image of a goddess on a coin or a marble statue smiling from the shadows of a museum, ask yourself, is this the face of divinity, or the face of a woman who bled, killed, and wept her way into eternity? If this story haunted you the way it should, don't look away. Share this with someone who thinks history is all marble columns and noble deeds, because behind every throne there's a skeleton. And sometimes, it's still smiling. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep digging. The past is never as dead as it seems.